Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our session, From Concept to Clinic, Accelerating Medical Device Innovation with AI. My name's Chris Tignanelli. I'll be moderating the session today. So I am a trauma critical care surgeon here at the University of Minnesota. I'm also the Associate Dean for Data Science in the medical school. And then I'm also involved in a local med tech startup. I'm one of the chief medical officers for that company. We're at the collision point of three really powerful trends in medicine. The first one is just AI itself. The next one is regulation of software as a medical device and AI in general. And then the third one is really how do we integrate these AI tools into workflow and get clinicians comfortable using them and trusting them. So we're going to discuss some of this today. I'd like to introduce our panelists. So we have three panelists, and I'm going to introduce each of them, and then I'm going to ask them to open with a moment of failure or near miss in innovation. So we're going to start with Kevin. So this is Kevin Sexton. He's a surgeon scientist. He's board certified in general surgery and clinical informatics. He's a professor of surgery and biomedical informatics at Vanderbilt University, where he also serves as the vice chair of innovation for the section of surgical sciences. He's also been very involved with medtech startups over the last 15 years. He's had successful exits, and he currently serves as an advisor to numerous companies, including but not limited to Decisio Health, Qventus, and Doximity. So Kevin, can you tell us about a near miss or failure?
Too numerous to count. So I'll shine a light on a funny story for me. So part of what I study in trauma is how to predict hemorrhage when someone's bleeding to death. So we were really proud of some work we did with venous waveform physiology to correlate that to cardiac output. We worked really hard, and we could correlate within about 1% of being off. And so we go to show this to some military medics, and the data is beautiful in the animal experiment that we're running. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it shows them cardiac output, and then the medic looks at me and goes, "Doc, what's that number? Like, I need red, yellow, green. Tell me they're doing well, or tell me they need an intervention. I have no idea what that means." So that's the first time I learned you should be talking to your customers or whoever's going to use whatever you're building as early as you can for feedback.
That's a really good example, and it really gets to that whole how do you integrate these tools into actual practice where the end users are going to be using them. Next, I'd like to introduce Patricia Khashayar. She's the director of International Institute for Biosensing and a research associate professor at the University of Minnesota. She leads an international institute which brings together experts from academia, nonprofits, industry, and government agencies to develop partnerships, identify barriers to advancing biosensing research, and generate innovative solutions. Importantly, she's developed multimodal and multi-omic biosensors and point-of-care tools for patient stratification, diagnosis, and treatment monitoring. So Patricia, same question.
Thank you, Chris. So I have a different type of story. So we were developing a point of care I recently moved from Europe, from Belgium. So we were working on a tool and everything was super ready. We actually had our funding, and then I moved, and then we realized the regulations between Europe and US are different. Here, they don't accept the regulations in Europe, and Europe doesn't accept the GDPR and other regulations here. So the funding that I had is for Europe. I cannot use it here, and here I cannot apply because most of the things that I'm doing is in Europe, and according to Europe rules, the GDPR, I cannot share the data with here. So this is also another story. Know the regulations and try to find a way through them.
I think GDPR is something we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then last but not least, we have Nate Downing. Nate is a managing attorney at Gardner Law, and his practice focuses on FDA regulation. He regularly represents clients in front of the FDA on a variety of manners, including pharmaceuticals, medical devices, software as a medical device, medical foods, and nutritional supplements. So Nate, same question.
Yeah, in my field, I see a lot of, failures, meaning I get to get started with a company and, things don't work out, time runs out, funding works out. One that really stands out is it's not truly a failure, but it's heading that way. And one thing that I really enjoy is I get to see a lot of individuals who have practiced medicine, who have really gained a lot of knowledge, really climbed to the top of their field, and then they want to be able to share that knowledge through a product or whatever it might be. And I had an individual come to me a while back who really had a great idea, and then every time we spoke, there was a new idea, right? And so what I need, or what I try to help clients have, is a pathway forward. And when the idea changes constantly and the excitement is there, but we don't have a product, if you will, eventually time runs out. And so it's a failure in the sense that there was a lot of knowledge and a lot of things that could have been shared and really helped patients, helped other physicians. But based on the fact that we weren't able to really get a focus and really figure out that we have to have something, some product, some medical product, it just did not get to where it should be and where it could be. And so, I think about that a lot of now when I even talk, I have a different talk track when I meet somebody just based on that experience to make sure even more and more, and I not only have on my legal or my regulatory hat, but also as much of a business hat if I can have on.
It's important to be really focused and watch out for like scope creep a little bit or idea creep. Yeah. So we're going to jump right into it. So Kevin, I'm going to kick it off with you. So what's a moment when you realize that an AI-enabled device or tool has clinical potential? And then, so what do you do in that moment? And then importantly, what ends up killing that momentum most often when someone has a great idea?
Yeah, so to start with, I think I get most excited about AI when I see a team that has really defined the problem well, to the point that the solution almost becomes obvious. They understand their customers and the problem they're solving to the point that it's just intuitive. It's almost like the clinicians are pulling the product forward, wanting to use it. And I think what gets folks stalled a lot is what I see in that when it comes to data, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, there's the data to create the tool, and then there's the workflow and implementation part of the tool. And I see people sell a lot of technology and not realize that healthcare is also a service business, and they have to think about how they're going to integrate in that service component. So I've seen a lot of great tech that couldn't deliver on the service, and that's where I see folks stall most often now.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And so, and a lot of the devices that you're seeing, are they really being driven by the clinical subject matter expert, or are they being driven more by engineers, or is it really the unity of the different groups working together?
Yeah, it comes from all types. Typically, when I see internal technologies, they're led by the engineering team with a clinical champion. Almost all of the external technologies try and find a clinical champion to sponsor them, and they don't realize that in healthcare there are about 6 different buyers, right? There's the financial buyer or the CFO, the technical buyer or the person in IT that needs to implement the tool, the operational buyer who owns the metric. And so they think a clinical champion is all they need to get going externally. That rarely, if ever, works. But I think internally, you have a leg up if you have a clinical champion helping you develop the product.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen before is the clinical champion will have a great idea, but there isn't a huge business use case for that idea. I think this is something we see all the time. It's a fringe use case, or it's a rare disease, for example, and a company's looking at the more common diseases, things that they can deploy more readily. And I see that as kind of a barrier as well sometimes.
No, absolutely. And I mean, we have a saying in our shop that it's not stupid if it works and people will use it. But you have to have both components. It has to work and someone has to use it. Yeah. Not just one individual.
Yeah. And Patricia, anything you'd want to add?
I actually wanted to focus more on the co-design part. So most of the time, it's correct that we have to have the champion in-house. We also have to have, like, as you said, there are different stakeholders that might be using that. So we have to have, like, their perspective while designing. So if we design something and it doesn't fit into the workflow of a hospital, it's impossible to use that because you cannot change the whole hospital in order to be compatible with what you have. So the co-design part and having the end user in mind is super important in order, it's kind of like a guarantee that you have somewhere that you can use that one or you can test it. So
What successful approaches have you seen for co-design?
So actually, something that we learned like really soon after we started some of our project was like when you have an idea and you want to like test it in somewhere, just ask them, what are your expectations from the tool that we are developing for you, and what are actually the infrastructure that you have? Because if, for instance, we were doing a project with Africa, and 1 year in the project, we realized they didn't have freezer. We knew that they didn't have stable electricity. We knew all of those things, but nobody told us that they didn't have freezer, and everything that we had was cold chain based. So it was kind of like, they didn't mention it, we never realized, and so that was kind of the thing that could have been prevented like early in the project, and we could have changed, but 1 year after everything was designed, it was like waste of money and time.
Yeah. We see a lot similarly with, I do a lot of work on clinical decision support systems and deploying AI-enabled tools into healthcare. And we see a lot of similar issues. Like just because you'll sit down with one health system and get it to work there doesn't mean it's going to translate to another health system. So you almost have to do multi-institutional kind of usability testing. And the way that we've kind of set it up is we do dual usability testing. So you always have end users, and usually a multidisciplinary group of end users. And then we also have experts do like a heuristic evaluation to also optimize the usability of these tools before we actually implement them into care. Yeah, I don't know if you've done similar stuff. Yeah.
Similar stuff. I think Steve Blank said that no business plan survives first contact with the customer. And for us, we say no software survives first contact with the user. People will use tools in unexpected ways, and we even populated Epic with synthetic data on an instance for us to try and optimize usability, because it's so important. We see a lot of projects fail at that level.
Let's take it one more level further, especially with regards to AI. What are best practices, in your opinions, for how we can approach testing AI in real-world environments when lives are at stake?
Do you want me to jump in first?
Yes.
Or again? Yeah, fair enough. And I think it's trying to define what your minimum viable product is. And when I see companies that tell me that they can solve everything and be all things to all people at all times, every red flag in my head goes off. And I don't want to put that anywhere near a human. When someone tells me what their limitations are and they have really well defined their constraints and where they have issues with accuracy, sensitivity, or specificity, I'm much more apt to design a stepwise protocol for them. And we use a lot of stepped wedged cluster randomized trials within our clinics so that we can discern what the actual effect of the tool is, and everyone ultimately gets to use the tool.
And you do those as IRB-approved research studies?
Absolutely.
Patricia or Nate?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to know what you want to study, like you said, Kevin, in getting FDA involvement, right? I think a lot of companies do get excited and say, well, I can do all these things, but you think about your patient population exploding with each new endpoint you add or something like that, it becomes unrealistic. And I often will talk to customers or something, I'll say, well, what's the minimum thing you need to be viable on the market? And study that and find a way to survive so that you can add on additional studies while you're post-market. And now you have a holistic plan, and you can use things like a predetermined change control plan with FDA that says, okay, here's my first iteration, but FDA, here's what it's going to look like to gather more data and be flexible so we don't have to wait 1.5 years or 2 years for every time to treat new patients. But I'm on market, and now I've got a post-market plan. And it really goes to something you said earlier, too, both of you, about kind of the phase, knowing all the different users, You have to understand that a CFO is going to look at this. You can get a pre-market approval and go to a hospital, and the CFO says, I'm not paying for this. Like, I'm not doing the bill and buy where I pay it, and hopefully I get reimbursed or whatever it might be. And so there's a lot of different considerations of, okay, it's great that you got market authorization, but what do you do after that to actually get adoption and to make sure you're getting payment and all of those things. So all of those end users come into the clinical study as well as your overall total product life cycle plan.
Patricia, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm going to add one more thing. So it's like when we are talking about AI-based system, normally we focus more on the system, on the risk that the system is going to have. We don't look at the risk that the AI itself is bringing to the equation. So it would be helpful that before doing the real-world testing, to actually know what are the risks of our AI part, our data part. Is it like, yes, for sometimes we have data, but are we allowed to use those data? We are missing some data. Can we extrapolate and just like generalize the data? So we have to have a clear understanding of what are the risks, what are the problems that we might be having from the data part itself, from the AI part, and like have a plan for that one also, because that is something that we are going to face in the middle of the project. And if we don't have a solution, and as Nate said, we have to literally have that one also part of our IRB, and we have to have like the approvals for that one.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, whenever we deploy AI tools as part of like a step wedge pilot, one of our protocols is we have to actually run it in the background for like 3 months and then actually see how it performs. How does it perform when we have missing data, for example, and things like that. Yep, exactly.
Right? Because the real world's messy.
Yeah, it really is. And the retrospective validation that you get, the performance, like, oh, AUROC is 0.85, yay. We see on average about a 12% performance drop from retrospective to real world deployment. And Mayo did a publication, showed the exact same weird enough 12% performance drop. So I don't know why that is, but that's the performance drop that we see for retrospective to real world prospective data. And speaking of data, data is critical for successful AI, and a lot of times people cite data as a barrier for industry because they have limited access to patients, for example. What are some thoughts or ideas on how we can overcome this data barrier? Industry or multi-institutional data, interoperability of data. So let's see, maybe Kevin, you go for it first.
All right, I can start. I think there are a couple ways. At Vanderbilt, we have something called the synthetic derivative, which has around 3 million lives that's been systematically de-identified to look at model performance. It's a good first start. I think that most technologies that I see use Mimic or European databases. That limits, I think, their generalizability. And so what I'm seeing as an emerging model is a lot of, back to Tricia's point, a lot of co-development opportunities where startups are partnering with academic medical centers and we're co-developing the technology, and each of us, to Nate, contractually trying to participate in the value that we create and helping through the regulatory process. So that's exciting to me because we get to participate in creating the technologies that we're going to use instead of being treated more like a customer in a vendor relationship.
And how does that impact like the IP protections or aspect for that tool? Because you have the health system data potentially and potentially some of their clinicians, but then partner with a med tech company.
Yeah, and that's an interesting piece about it, Chris, because we don't generally have a lot of patents or other things coming out through AI. Instead, what we can do is help them create a moat around the technology by success in the market. And when we've been really successful with a couple of iterations, we've been able to help the client or help the startup develop a pricing strategy so that we've de-risked their technology to the point that instead of coming off as a SaaS or software as a subscription model, they can now do an implementation-based payment and then participate in the revenue that they create. And that's what I've seen really be successful, particularly for under-resourced settings where rural hospitals can't afford a SaaS and they have a lot of point solutions.
Anything else to add, Patricia and Nate?
I'm going to give an example. So as I told you, I just moved from Europe. In Europe, they are moving towards like federated data alliances. So that's actually super helpful because not only in the project, they encourage both industry and the universities to work with each other, but also share the data. So that would kind of like help. And also everyone is bringing their data to the table, but under the European Union, so that it would be a kind of like federated government, so everyone has access to that. But at some point, for instance, some countries, they don't move the data. So the data is being analyzed under their own regulations. So for instance, Germany has one of the highest regulations. So everything is happening in Germany, but the result is being pulled. So you don't have that kind of like the IP issue, like the changes in the regulations, and still everyone can use the same data. And they are also encouraging that in the new project, if such a data alliance exists, just add your data to that alliances to help them grow larger.
That makes a lot of sense. I haven't heard of anything like that in the U.S. There's some small groups. We're actually a part of one that are starting to do it, but it's a handful, 4 or 5 institutions that are kind of doing that type of thing. Yeah. All right, let's get to some regulatory stuff. So Nate, what's changed in how the FDA views AI-enabled devices today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest change and the most important change is familiarity, right? If you look at, FDA has a website. I don't actually know, like the last time I looked, the number hadn't changed. I don't know if it's being kept up right now, but it basically reports on AI, ML devices cleared, approved, and that number just continues to climb, right? And every time FDA sees something, they get more comfortable with it. They understand the, verification testing that goes into whatever modeling, the robustness of the algorithms being used for the AI, ML device. And so that's really key, right? Because if FDA speaks the language, they ask more pointed questions, they have less questions, and so that's, that's key in making sure you take advantage of that, trying to find similarities. If you have a product, so FDA can start already understanding, they've seen something similar, this isn't new or unique, or, it has uniqueness, but there's a lot of congruity there. But I also think, the regulations aren't updating to list, well, if it's an AI ML device, here's the things you're going to do, right? There's been, 21st Century Cures Act gave us some things on software, but truly FDA still has the same way in reviewing. And so with the familiarity means it's still the job of industry to educate and to make sure you're getting in front of the FDA, which is called pre-submissions, and saying, hey, we have a device, it's enabled to do X, Y, and Z. We want to teach you, FDA, before we even submit anything. We just want you to understand our technology, our concepts, and FDA can start to get the wheels turning and trying to find similarities. What review have they done previously that might be similar? Right now you're starting to get some efficiencies built into your process. And so also FDA has done a lot of guidance documents, right? FDA will say to on their website, this is a guidance document, it's not final, there are other ways to do it, but if you can do it consistent with a guidance document, you're going to do it that way. And so making sure you read those guidance documents and the principles FDA wants to incorporate in a pre-market submission. Cybersecurity is huge, right? A lot of these devices are connected devices. That's how updates are pushed, how data is shared, all sorts of other things. And so not just thinking from a verification of your software, but also all the angles of risk. I know risk was mentioned earlier, and so also one thing FDA always asks for is, well, show us your risk management file. And as FDA is used to seeing more and more devices that are incorporating artificial intelligence, they're going to also better understand what they expect to see in a risk management file, which means we have to be more robust in our risk management process. And so all those things go together to put a better pre-market submission together. But ultimately, still, there's always going to be questions. FDA is going to have different reviewers. Right now, there's kind of there's a changing in some employees that FDA will say very kindly. And so if you're relying on experience and some of that is lost, now we start back to having to explain further to really make sure we're defending our position. So I think what's really changed is the experience that FDA has gotten, and then some of the guidance documents, as well as software as a medical device and things like the predetermined change control plan. But a lot remains the same from an overall, how does FDA approach a medical device? Well, it's the same if it's AI or if it's implantable from 60 years ago, such as a pacemaker.
How does I can see how a large company can get through those regulatory hurdles, but how does a startup company get through that? How can they work smarter,
Yeah, and when I talk to them, I think it's a realization, and there's two things for a startup why they should go to FDA early. One is you don't have what a huge multi-billion-dollar corporation has in multiple individuals who are in front of FDA every day, right? You just don't have that. But you also probably need to consider funding a little bit differently than some of these multi-billion-dollar corporations, right? And so when you go to FDA earlier, you get two things. You start to tell your story early, so you're educating FDA, and now you've got the people who are going to review your product submission are also getting educated on it, and those submissions, those informational pre-submissions are free, right? The only thing is the time put in, which time is valuable, I get it, but that's going to save you a lot. But also, when you have an investor and they said, have you spoken to FDA, and you say yes, that's a light bulb for that investor. They're way more excited about your technology and your prospects knowing you've already engaged the body that's going to give you approval to market your device, right? So getting to FDA early if you're a startup is important. Now, I want to caveat that. It's not right away, right? We can't be having scope creep all the time and going back to FDA every 3 months and say, well, we were wrong here, now here's our plan, right? That's not it. But when you have a design and you understand the problem you're trying to solve, you may not have a final device design, but the problem you're trying to solve, the way you're approaching it, your kind of basic MOA, it's good to get in front of FDA early and really burn down risk. And like I said, the benefits from an investor standpoint are also great.
What are startups trying to get when they, what is the outcome that you want when you go for a pre-submission inquiry with the FDA? What do they want to get out of it typically?
Yeah, so my first one is, I'll say, and it's called an informational pre-sub, and it really means FDA is actually not going to say anything. Now that's not true, they often say a lot, but they don't have to say anything. It's just a way to tell your story. I think it's invaluable because you get FDA without FDA having to think, well, what's wrong? What should we ask for? What data more should we require? They're just listing. And ultimately, FDA, I like partnering with FDA because they probably will start to give you some insight into what they're thinking. But that initial pre-submission is really just a way to get your story in front of FDA. And I use the word story a lot. And we all know it's not fictional, but it's the way you're going to approach your device in your pre-market phase that you want FDA to be thinking the same way. And then when you get to what's called a pre-submission on an issue, right, an issue, a Q-sub or whatever it might be, now you've got to know, okay, I want to do this device, but shoot, my biocompatibility testing, I'm not quite sure. I know AI, ML, it might not be biocompatibility, but there is also a lot of correlation there with a device that may be implanted using AI, ML. Biocompatibility is a huge issue in getting a product approved through FDA. And that can be sometimes add 6 years of review to a product. It's not uncommon. So you get into a pre-submission and you start saying, well, here's my biocompatibility strategy, FDA. And what you're looking for is FDA saying, okay, if you do these things, and this is your intended use, and this is your indication, and these are the, your device design, you've got a good chance of getting approval or whatever it might be. And so you give yourself certainty. So once again, you go back to an investor, you say, not only have we done an informational pre-submission, now we've done an issue pre-submission where we've actually gotten feedback from FDA on our approach, from our evidentiary approach, and we have more, confidence in getting market authorization based on our communications with FDA.
Excellent. Tim and Patricia, anything you want to share from your experiences with working with regulatory bodies such as the FDA?
I'll say it's intimidating. You want to get someone like Nate on your side and on your team as soon as it's fiscally viable for your organization, because I think what happens is you can try and do a lot as an entrepreneur and you're used to pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and trying to learn everything that you can. It's so much easier, if you've never dealt with this, to have someone pull you along in the right direction. Mm-hmm. It saves more time than the expense.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Well,
Oh yeah, go for it.
Oh, sorry. It's my experience is mainly with CE, but it's also the same. If you have them on board from the beginning, and the risk analysis part is super critical for everyone when they are doing the regulatory part, because they know what might go wrong. And if you say I have these risks probably, and I didn't have it at the end, so that's actually a plus point for you. And I think it would be really makes everything go faster.
How do things change going outside of the United States? If you want to market your device internationally, how does that work?
Yeah, so it's, it's geographical, and actually a lot of geographies will rely on a US or an EU determination. And so the question used to be when companies would come is they'd say, well, do I want to go to the EU first or the US? And for a while they'd say, well, I'm going to go to the EU. I've got the MDD, right, a little bit easier to get through, and then MDR comes along in the EU, and now if you're a Class 2B or a Class 3 device, it's much more difficult. And so now you say, well, I might go to the US first. So that's just a component I talk to is, what's your launch strategy from a global standpoint? Because if you go to one of those geographies, now you open up other geographies. Japan, Korea, they're allowed to take note of CE mark, for example, and say, well, you've got CE mark, you still have a submission in these geographies, but it's much easier. Australia, New Zealand, they also can recognize others. They have a pretty robust program. There are some areas that are almost unregulated, you might say, but You need sometimes certificate of a certificate that the government gives that says, well, this is a good product. We've agreed it's in good standing. All these things that go along with it. And so you might need that to go to other geographies. So it's not, each geography really is its own problem. You don't really get a one-size-fits-all. There's things like MDSAP and other types of submissions you can do, but they're not fully aligned yet where it's just a smooth, like you get this and you're on market. And so having a kind of a step-by-step strategy and understanding what's the trigger for this geography to provide approval and kind of working backwards sometimes is really important.
So now you got your device, FDA approved. How can you ensure that the technology in there, that it works well with hospital systems, that it works with their data infrastructure, it integrates into clinician workflow? What things can you do, Kevin?
Yeah, it's really finding great partners for testing. I think time back into, you just have to talk to people that are going to be responsible for the different areas. If you understand who owns the technical component, the operational component, the clinical component, the financial component, and where their problems are and how you meet their needs, I feel like that helps more and more with enterprise sales. The challenge that I see a lot of folks come with a consistent model of, we just want you to pay a month-to-month subscription, and they have no risk or skin in the game, at least from the healthcare perspective. I'm much more interested when I see folks that come with some sort of performance-based model that lets them participate in the value that they create. So at least at that point, I know we've all got skin in the game to make this work. Because I don't know about your experience with implementations, but around 3/4 of the time, the technology doesn't work the way they think it's going to, even if they've done an implementation at another academic medical center. And what we've started doing is, most folks, when you're in the sales phase, tell you implementation's turnkey. Never happens. So I'll go to my analysts, calculate the number of hours to do the work to get this thing to work, and then go to the company and say, it's this much money. How do you want to represent that value? We can represent it a lot of different ways, but I'm trying to, at all times, be transparent, but then get credit for the work that we're doing in the system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you mind giving an example of what a performance-based compensation would be?
Sure. So we helped, during my time in Arkansas, we helped a company called VetaPoint solve a problem that we had with getting documents into the medical record. They were a fintech company. And so we helped them do an Epic integration. And in exchange for that, we had the software to use for free. But in terms of these companies, they needed a reference client, right? Someone that could show off their technology and participate in sales calls with them. Part of our agreement was any deal we helped them close, we had a time-limited royalty based on that. And so not only did we get the tool, we were participating and helping with sales as a reference client and then creating value that way for the system.
I think this is pretty common because we see this a lot in our health system here at mHealth Fairview. There'll be startup companies that they have not deployed yet in any health system. They need to get in. They say, we'll give you this solution for free. But then it's like, okay, well, we still got to map all of these variables to your platform, for example, and that's 200 hours, and then we got to do any user interface testing and all that, and to actually deploy these things, it's a large amount on the health system's IT team to actually do this integration. So stuff like that where it's like, okay, well, we'll get some royalties to kind of pay us back for all that, maybe some co-development, maybe even some IP or something, that can help kind of smooth that gap, I guess, Patricia, what's working internationally? What should we be doing?
So I'm going back to what Nate was saying with the new medical devices rule. So normally in Europe, everything is under European Commission. So that's a good thing because European Commission each year says, these are my priorities. So all the calls and everything is aligned with that one and everyone is working together towards that. But according to the new medical devices regulation, so it's kind of a little different. So because as Nate said, there are the notified bodies, but in different states and in different countries, in Europe now the rules are different. So whatever you are taking there, you have to retest and show it works in every state. For instance, in Spain, they have like 11 federales, and it has to be tested in all of the 11 federales, else you cannot work there. So that, from that point of view, it's getting crazy. That's why it's like many of the, even the European like startups, they are bringing their product to the US to get like the FDA. And with the FDA, they are going back because it's going to like speed up the whole process. But when you are going to the Europe, exactly, you have to know which countries you are going for, and then like go for the key opinion leaders there, because the KOLs play a critical role in order to smoothen your process, because you have to retest everything in like a lot of hospitals and like centers. So by having the KOL on your side, it could help you at least like maybe merge two of them together, or like as Kevin was saying, they would be your reference system, so that you can say like, it worked there, you know that person is like the best in their field, so it's going to speed up the process.
That's great to know. It seems like a little bit of a headache doing some of this stuff abroad versus
Now
how
for
it is now. Yeah.
having a notified body, so
Yeah.
you have to be in queue for that.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Well, we've talked a lot about the current state of things. Let's start looking at the future. So by 2030, I'm going to go right down in order here. So Kevin, you'll be first. But by 2030, what's one AI-driven medical device capability that will be commonplace, but it sounds like science fiction today?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a fundamental change in interface. I grew up reading a lot of comic books, and I'm a huge dork if you haven't figured that out already. But I think that we're going to see an interface like Jarvis in Iron Man, where it's all voice, and then you'll have some adaptive visual interface for the data within an electronic medical record. Because you've seen this, every user looks at the EMR differently and customizes it to their own individual practice patterns. I think you're going to see them be able to do that with voice and a heads-up display that is truly personalized and precise for them.
And you're kind of seeing pilots of that now with a lot of the AI scribe technology. You know, they have ambient listeners in all of the ER rooms. You know, they're listening and writing the notes, and then potentially that stream of conversation could be generating differential diagnoses, you know, like potentially prompting tests and so forth. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Patricia?
I'm going for injectable nanorobots, so nanonites. So
Nice.
you can just have them in your body. They can figure out what is the problem and treat them on themselves. So they need like a lot of data to be able to diagnose what is happening and to be able to treat. And like, I don't know if you have seen like Bloodshot. It's like,
No.
that is my future.
Nanomedicine?
Yeah.
Nice, nice. Nate?
I'm not a doctor, so I'll answer this a little bit differently, but what I think you're going to see more and more is FDA's acceptance of, I'll call them like high-risk diagnostics, right? Is when you see AI come on board, it's typically, you'll get, you know, a cancer diagnosis that's, you know, paired with standard of care, right? So it's kind of like, well, it might be right, it might be wrong, but, you know, it's just a little extra pile on. And more, I think you're going to see really a standalone diagnosis that FDA is allowing, you know, these high-risk life or death situations to be, basically diagnose yes or no via an AI ML device, because they're understanding better how to review the robustness of the algorithm and more data, and they're just seeing it more, right? You see in the news, you can find, you know, skin cancer devices, you know, other types of cancer devices that are more standalone diagnostics than you would have in the past. So I imagine that that's going to pick up, because clearly there's efficiencies for all of you in that process, but FDA is getting more confident and comfortable with making those determinations of market authorization.
I'll jump in too, because I think this is fun. So I think one of the things that we're really going to see in the next 5 years is more autonomous surgery and procedures. In 2022, Johns Hopkins did autonomous surgery on pigs. They actually went in, robot went in, resected a piece of bowel, put the intestine back together. They did it 3 times. It was in CNN and on a lot of news channels. And you know, that was 3 years ago. And I think it's my guess is it's going to be a lot like autonomous driving. You know, initially it'll be things like, you know, when you teach a car how to drive, it's just like, can you keep it in its lane? Can you parallel park? So I think it's going to start being things like, okay, I'm ready to close this port site, close, and then the robot closes the port site. I'm ready to make this anastomosis, which is a connection between 2 tubes. Do it, and it runs that algorithm. And I think you're going to see that, eventually grow into fully autonomous surgery. Maybe not in 5 years, but I do think that's definitely coming down the pipeline 10, 20 years in the future. So follow-up question kind of related to all of these innovations that we're going to see in the future is what infrastructure or data resource capabilities are we going to need to unlock the next generation of AI-driven medical devices? Kevin?
Yeah, well, okay. Happy to kick off. So I took this question a little bit differently in that I think what we're going to have to unlock is speed, and speed at the academic medical center level. And when I think about speed for AMCs and others, it's a symptom, it's not the etiology. Yeah. So sometimes it can be because you don't have the correct data infrastructure and governance to move a contract through quickly. Sometimes it can be that you don't have the right contracts or agreements in place to do this type of work. And then sometimes it can be that the institution just hasn't made up its mind as to what it's going to prioritize or what its risk tolerance will be for some of these. So I think the key to unlocking this is unlocking speed at the organization locally and whatever that means for them. Either getting more comfortable with this type of work and risk or establishing the structures that allow you to move quickly. Because at least in startup land, sales cycle for an academic is 18 to 24 months. You don't have that kind of time.
Yeah. That's one of the barriers that we see. It takes a long time sometimes to execute these memorandum of understandings, master service agreements, data use agreements. It take a very long time. And then also just structuring the data.
Yeah.
Pulling the data sometimes. We used to be in a phase, we have moved everything to these AI-ready data marts that we can pull data pretty quick, but not many institutions in the US have done that. And it used to take us close to about a year or so just to pull data. And most institutions in the US that we collaborate with on a research standpoint, if we say like, hey, we want to build this AI algorithm, can you pull, 30,000 of these images? They'll be like, sure. And then you won't hear from them for like 6 months, so they actually have them pulled. So building those capabilities, I agree, speed is going to be critical. Mm-hmm. Patricia, anything you want to add?
I'm going for like more uniform regulations and ethical foresight over data-related research, because it's like now the regulations in different states are different. Yeah. So it also limits the amount of like data sharing between different groups because they have like different perspective towards how the data should be used. Mm-hmm. And this is also something that is going to be limiting the usage of the data in other centers. And also because of like the ethics, because of the same thing, the ethics is different. So it's like most of the time here you are going for opt-out. So the patient is saying, I don't want it, but it doesn't specify what are the reasons that you can use my data. Yeah. And that is kind of like limitation in some states, not everywhere. That is like why you are using this data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a lot of the data protections, they are definitely something that hinder some of the ability to develop these tools or to do research in the space. And that's one of the reasons I think that you're seeing such a rise of federated learning collaboratives, because institutions can keep the data local, but some institutions still don't allow identified data to sit in their federated repositories. So that limits it. Let's say you're interested in like neurology or neurosurgery. You're out. If you want to do any computer vision-based stuff, any MRIs of the head or CAT scans of the head are protected health information, so you can't use those. So it really adds a bunch of limitations that are geospatial mapping. You end up getting really limited on what geospatial data elements you can even have in there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It also limits. It also limits the collaboration with Europe because of the same rule, we are not aligned with GDPR.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I would add real quick. I think it's when startups will come to me, or even medium companies, is with a kind of an AI tool, if it's software, as a medical device, they're always hoping it's clinical decision support. Really, and it could do a lot of things. I've seen, they really come with an idea that, hey, we're going to change this field, we're going to do all these things. Oh, and by the way, it's also clinical decision support, which essentially when you get to classify something as clinical decision support, you don't have to go through an FDA review, right? And so it means you get to avoid data, because data is really hard to come by for these smaller companies. It's really expensive. Even a 60 or 80 person pivotal trial, which can be done in medical device, right? Not done in pharma. Just the centers and the activation, and at least you have to have differentiation of sites, right? That costs a lot of money, and if they can avoid that, they can get to market. Now, do they get to market with something that makes a difference sometimes? It depends. I mean, some clinical decision support tools really, truly are, and they really make efficiencies and help physicians, but some are trying to solve a problem that they really can't, because they're trying to say we're one thing and then do another, and just to avoid the data capture that's required to get through FDA, and that's a huge issue from a regulatory standpoint.
The clinical decision support guidance, is that still draft guidance, or has that been finalized? And then the other broader question is, draft guidance for the FDA, is that still real guidance or not?
Yeah, so if you take the draft guidance, like the clinical decision support, I utilize it the same. All guidance is truly guidance, and so if I can't fit guidance,
Whether it's a draft or not.
whether it's draft or final, it really is about another period of comments. I mean, to really put it as a very kind of basic thing, that's what happens, right? Is you get one more round and there's more input, and it's nice for industry to move towards final, and because clients will say, well, that one's draft and that one's final, not the same situation, so I'll file the final and not the draft. I say, well, the draft is FDA's best thinking, so if they haven't finalized it, sometimes they just don't get around to it. And right now, you might not see a finalization. Like if you have a draft guidance, FDA right now, they kind of have this broad 10-for-1 rule. What it truly means, I don't know. But if they're going to add a new regulation, they're supposed to remove 10 others. Well, you're not going to get a lot of new guidances if that falls within that 10-to-1, because it's hard to peel back 10. How strongly that's required, I'm not sure, but it's certainly something as a consideration. And so that draft might be all you're going to get. And I would say if FDA provided their best thinking, whether they say it's draft or final, if you're able to follow that, you should follow that. If you can't follow a final guidance, but you have a reasonable way of doing it, I will always put that in front of FDA. And I'll say, hey, FDA, as you say, it's not the only way to do it. We've got a good way to do it. Here's our rationale.
Gotcha. I think we have some computer science, engineering students, and medical trainees in the audience. So is there anything that they should be doing differently to prepare for the future landscape? Kevin?
Yeah. Sorry, I'll just get used to going first.
Yeah.
That's why you sat there. We were
You can be the blocker. I really think it's the more that they can understand their customer. Don't build in isolation. You have a ton of technical skills and abilities. Don't start with the technology, start with the problem. You have to solve a problem that's meaningful for users. The technology is amazing. It changes rapidly, but in healthcare, there's a lot of risk, as we've heard from everyone up here, about tech once it's developed. But if you solve a problem and you solve it well, you will get pulled into the market. If you are not feeling that pull, you are not solving a problem. And it's when you feel that pull that now is the point that you apply leverage. You go for funding. You go for the capital resources or the studies that you need to do to move to the next phase. Before that, I really think you're still trying to figure out what's best to build.
Great advice.
I'm going to build on your comments. So you should know what is the problem. You should also know the market and what is the competition in the market, so that, for instance, if something is already in the market, you have to say what I'm making is better than that, else what is the reason that you're making that? So you should really know the added values of what you are adding to the market, else it really doesn't make sense that the thing is in the market. I'm not saying it's better than you, but it's going to be easier for them because they are already in the market to have a larger market share. So it's going to make your life harder. But if you say like, I'm adding these to that, it's going to make everything faster and easier for you.
Can I just emphasize that, because that is so important. So I'm also the scientific director of University of Minnesota's program for clinical AI. We build AI tools, some with the goal of commercializing. And I can't tell you how many people have come in with an idea that already exists on the market. It happens like literally every week. And our first question now when people come in is we have them do a market comparison review. But this happens all the time. So always do your research, see what's on the market. see how you're different. Have they externally validated their algorithm? What data they trained? Like, how is your solution different?
Yeah, and I'll jump in and add to that. If you think you're going to find that information in a Google search, you're probably wrong.
Yeah.
I use Reddit a lot.
is it called?
Reddit.
Oh, Reddit.
Yeah, sorry, the
Reddit.
accent. Sometimes I put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. But we were looking at hydration wearables for athletes. We made the same post in the subreddit for triathletes, ultramarathoners, marathoners, and the like. We had 10x the engagement on the triathlete post. Where do you think we went? It's not rocket science, but also they told us who our competitors were and that we're doing similar things in the space. So crowdsource this as much as you can.
That's a good idea, yeah.
I would say you have to be realistic. You know, it's great to have grand goals, and you should, and it helps more patients, but also grand things require grand evidence or grand data. And so a lot of times companies, their entire goal will be like, I want to get this on the market, but I don't want to have to prove things. And so I say that's fine, you'll get commiserate claims, and they may not be anything, right? And then we also have to figure out how to have FDA say, yeah, this should be on the market, because they also take those considerations into account. And so as you are developing something, you need to always be thinking, what will it take to prove this claim I want to make or this claim I want to make? Because as much as you say your intended use and your indication make your device, the claims that you want to bring to market are just as big a part of that as anything else. And so being realistic about what you want to say and what you're going to be able to say with the resources you have, with the time or the plan, is ultimately going to set you up for success instead of reaching for the stars but not really having any kind of rocket ship to get there, if you will.
So I have more questions, but we're a little over half. And I want to open it up to the audience. I want you all to ask questions related to things that you may be working on or things that you're thinking about. So let's open it up. Please don't be shy. Small group. Let's have a nice chat. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Hi, amazing talk by everyone. I want to build on what Patricia said and ask a question to Nate. Patricia mentioned that risk analysis for AI-based products is again important. But then, if I'm looking for a new product, I'm following ISD 606, 149, 134. How do I build a product take the user needs to the user requirements and build on that while building the product is not going to the end point before that I have to prep and prepare for my FDA submission. So how do we start in that direction? Because I don't think there's enough data that FDA suggests, or there's not enough regulations yet to go in that direction.
I mean, a risk management file is a living document, right? So it's not complete. Even after submission, you still have to be updating it. If you do a post-market change, it's going to be updating. And so the way to do it is, like you were saying, as you're building each requirement, you need a robust document at that time. You need to look at your risk outcome. Do you need to mitigate that risk, or is it low enough? And it's just iterative over and over again. And if you keep doing that, you're going to have a risk management file that FDA is going to review and be able to follow back and work from your requirements and work forward to the risk to the patient. If you do it all at the end or try to guess the future at the beginning, what happens is a lot of the risks you put are really theoretical. When FDA doesn't want theoretical risks in there, they want proven risks that could happen to the patient and what would the level be, right? We know both occurrence and severity. And if you can do all that work and have a file that accounts for that while you're just considering the life of the device, then typically you're going to have a good conversation. The FDA is going to find something else in your risk management file. I almost never see a perfectly clean review of it because that's where FDA goes first. Like, how could we harm the patient? Okay, we've mitigated that. Now how do we help the patient? Now we've got our risk-benefit, balance considered, and you move towards market authorization.
So I'm an engineering professor. I've been involved in startups. I teach AI classes, but I've never been involved in an AI startup. So your talk got me thinking, how do people involved in this space think about IP protection? Can you pursue a patent on a specific model that you're using, or do you patent the data set and the model, or just, I'm not even sure how to start thinking about that concept, and I'm sure it's complicated.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an IP attorney, but certainly it's adjacent to what I do, and oftentimes it'll be on the model, on the algorithm, the way they do what they do. I don't often see it on the data set, but there's always little nuances, and that's also a big thing when it comes to clinical decision support, so kind of bringing it all the way around is when you do clinical decision support to fit within a certain regulation, you have to disclose how you do what you do. And so that's something I have to warn companies of is, hey, if you got an algorithm that really has a secret sauce that you want protected, you want to keep secret, which is, you get certain protection from IP, but also if you disclose it, well, that's out the window. Yeah. And so making sure that they understand the regulatory differentiation of a PMA or versus a clinical decision support or a 510K versus that, the disclosure requirements also might have to, tell the world your secret sauce. And so, but typically what I see around it is on the algorithm or the, I'm not a scientist either, a computer scientist. There's probably a lot of words I'm missing to describe what's happening underneath the user interface, but that's what they're going to focus their IP on.
But there are now more patents actually on the AI and the modeling part. It also depends on the claim that you're providing. So if you say like, I'm adding these two and it's like, just like mixing a salad, that's something that is not going to be accepted because we are just adding these two and like, you can move this one and add another thing and you might have another result. But if you write the claims in a way that it actually shows the process, it's like literally building something. So I'm going back to Ria's questions too, because it's like the AI is literally the same as your technology. So when you are writing and making your technology, you know the risk, so you are building something. For the modeling part, you are also building something. So it's going to be a different process, but it's actually, now there are more models that is being actually patented. We patented one of our models, which is now granted, and another one is pending. But it's actually, it literally depends on the claims that you are offering. That's super important to distinguish it from like just mixing things and having the results.
And I'll just add, what I'm seeing is most companies have a multimodal strategy. There are more patents, but there's not a body of litigation around them to know or have comfort in what's going to give you freedom to operate. So almost all have some component of patent, some component of trade secret, and then some component of copyright, depending on where it's viable.
I can speak for what it's like getting it at the, so I'm at the University of Minnesota, and are you there also? Yeah. UMD, okay. So I don't know if they use University of Minnesota Twin Cities Tech Commercialization Office or not, but the way that typically works for us professors is if we develop some AI-enabled tool, then we loop in TechCom, and then they'll sit down with us, we'll go through it, we'll do a review to see if there's anything already out there. They already have a patent attorney law firm that they have on retainer that they'll bring in, and then they actually take it from there. You'll sit down with the patent attorneys, work with them, they'll put together all the documents, you do have to weigh in on certain meetings and such, give them all publications, all presentations, et cetera, and then they will actually go and submit the patent for you. I've done that maybe 3 or 4 times or so, but it's always been the algorithm. It's never been the data set. It's the algorithm we get patented. And then you have a lot of options. We've had companies want to license it out, and you can license the algorithm to them for some, a fee every time it runs on a patient or something. And we've also had University of Minnesota spun out startup companies around a single AI-enabled tool. And they're really good at bringing in like someone from Carlson to help lead the business side and the researcher kind of as like a CMO type role or chief scientific officer type role. But yeah, usually TechCom, at least at the universities, is where you would start.
Thank you for the really engaging discussion. I'm curious about what's an example that you know of a really interesting source of data for a product that is nobody would have thought of this sort of data to found like an AI product.
The big data repositories in healthcare right now, so Mimic was mentioned. Mimic is Beth Israel's ICU data. It has everything. It has waveforms, images, notes, everything. You'll see it used a lot. So that's a very common one. PicCornet is another big one. So it involves a lot of different institutions in the US. We primarily work with the One Florida Plus network. So it includes all the hospitals in Florida, as well as Emory, Alabama, UC Irvine, and a couple others, University of Minnesota now. And you actually, technically through it, have access to whatever they have in their system. You'd have to pay for it. So you might be like, I want these MRIs or I want this. They'll have to build it, and it takes time. It might be 6, 7, 8 months before you get the data. But you do get access to whatever they have available. Another one is HCUP. So HCUP is a AHRQ data set, and they have a number of different sets of data. And the nice thing about the HCUP databases is it includes 97% of hospitals in the US. So the hospitalizations, they also have the ED visit database, and that's another nice one. Most universities already own that. Otherwise, you'd have to purchase it, which shouldn't be costly. There's some other good ones. You want to talk about some of the commercial data sets that exist?
Sure. So there are consumer data sets, Experian, Axiom, other companies that have those. Typically, you'll need someone with experience to help you navigate those data sets, but they can be extremely rich. You can see how many individuals are in a household, whether they buy plus-size clothes. It's really granular data. Not typical healthcare data as we would think of it, but very useful if you're trying to map out a product. I mean, I'll plug Reddit again. You can hit their API for 50,000 calls for free. If you're trying to do this, what I've seen most interestingly is how companies will take data from these different sets and pull them together to tell a story like Nate was telling us, but one that's plausible and one that I'm like, okay, I want to run that experiment to see if it holds water for our patients.
So I've now had time to think of a few more. So I'll just say them. So there's the All of Us data set, which is an NIH data set. And it has a lot more than just health data. It has a whole host of surveys. It has like step data, like daily living data. So there's a lot more data. It has like wearable data as well. So that's a rich data set. The original Framingham heart study is still ongoing, and they've integrated a lot of like wearable and other data as well into it. Patient-reported outcome measures, environmental data, stuff like that. The UK Biobank, I don't know much about that one. Are you familiar with the UK Biobank?
It has
It's a big one.
genomic data and
Yeah.
clinical data, and they are also adding proteomic data too, but doesn't have that much of like the wearables or like quality of life. But they are literally trying to extend like all the aspects, but it's perfect literally for the genomic data.
Yeah. Those are some of the big ones. I mean, there's something called N3C that all the large academic institutions participate in. They have to have something called a CTSA award. But that's primarily EHR type data. So.
What is the one for VA?
Yeah. What's that?
The
The
one
VA.
for VA. VA also has like a big data set that has a.
I'm not
I don't know
familiar
the
with
I
it.
don't know what it's called.
Yeah. The other thing that you can do too is if you need some like different data that's not collected. So I'll give an example. We have a tele-ICU. So we have a video camera and an audio recorder on 108 ICU patients across the state 24/7. So let's say you wanted to build some AI algorithm that could identify when someone's going to pull out their breathing tube or when whatever was going to happen. You could work with the institution to consent patients or their family member to allow that data to be used for research purposes. And then you can build a data set to solve that. So we did that actually with our surgical videos. So all our surgeries that we do robotically, we have an optional consent, and patients can consent to allow us to record and save their surgical video so that we could do AI research on it downstream. So you can always like kind of build these different data sets, but you usually need to partner with the health system to do such things. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Just another question that popped up just as you were mentioning to all of you. Right now, AI is more of that building up, like entering that med space and giving assistance. Do you really see it being autonomous, or do you see the future of more assisted support, or autonomy is possible because that's how we will plan to build devices, right? Like, do you want like AI saying, this is what's happening, or would you like it saying, this might be happening, you could explore this more?
I could jump in on that one with the provider in the middle. Those are annoying, always. I think you'll see the first iteration will be AI making autonomous decisions for low-risk things, like a normal chest x-ray or a normal abdominal radiograph. And then that will cognitively unburden the provider to do more complex tasks. I don't think you'll see complex autonomous decision-making for a while. It'll be provider in the middle, mostly because I'm not really sure how you insure that product.
Yeah, you'll never see I haven't heard of a single AI solution as an AURACA 1.0. So that's kind of a big issue. Like right now, I think all but one FDA-approved product is provider in the middle. There's only one fully autonomous approval, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's
I
changed.
think there's there's one that's truly like, you zap it and you get the diagnosis.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big issue, right, is if you're FDA, you're very comfortable when you know a provider's looking at it, so you de-risk that device. You can get de novo pathway. So if you're a company looking to get on the market, de novo, it's not cheap, but it's way better than what's called a PMA, both timelines and money and post-market and all of that. And so if you're a company looking to do something, like you described, the amount of data you have to gather and capture just to be able to do that is prohibitive almost, right? You think about the years you spend doing that, and now something else has become better. And I think FDA probably has to find a way to think differently in those situations, because they're always going to be approving something. You can imagine those are likely PMA devices. You're approving something when it should have been approved 5 years ago.
But there's also like we are moving through more multimodal diagnostic that they're gathering like big data, and the AI would be playing a big role in interpreting that data. They are not going to be autonomous, but they are going to help with the interpretation that the human would not be able to do it on their own. So I think that would be, for the time being, their main role here.
Hi, I have a question about maybe novel data sources and liability for physicians. So I've encountered this a few times where the physician maybe declines to participate in research because this new novel data set might prove to be some sort of liability against either the physician or the institution. Have you encountered that? And I guess, would you have any recommendations for how to broach that with a physician or a health system?
Yeah, so recording in the OR, like the actual OR room, is becoming a thing. There's 3 companies kind of in that space that are doing that: OR Black Box, Theator, and IBO Health. And one of the things they do is a lot of the legal teams at hospitals don't want them recording in an operating room because it could potentially open up those cases for discovery. So what they actually do is they set it up so that it's done around quality improvement. Can't be used for research, with the video being deleted after a period of time. The way that we do our recording is it's up to the physician if they want to consent the patient for their surgery to record for research. Some physicians say no, and then some are more comfortable with doing it. So it is a little variable there.
Yeah, I mean, I've encountered similar things, particularly with remote patient monitoring companies, when you're adding signal into the medical record, and that's where it becomes, what is your definition of the legal medical record, and understanding that really well, and who's responsible for the data that you put into the medical record. Because if you now are doing RPM on a panel of 300 patients for a doc that's not used to seeing that data, they don't know how to, they don't have the time to process all of it. And without support, they're still going to be liable for any abnormalities that may come through it. So there is some concern with remote patient monitoring limiting adoption.
I actually even will warn clients about how they take notes if they're not the physicians in a surgery. They might say, I'm just trying to learn about my device, we're in a limited launch or something, I want to take notes. I say, let's take very clear notes of what you can take, because I don't want anything that's seen like judgment, right? If that physician does something, you don't need to go in there and say, well, I don't know if they should have done that, because if something happens, your notes now can come into even a trial, and that could be an issue. That physician is probably not going to be happy that you're going to have a business issue, but there's other issues too. And so I think that question is even more than just AI. It's a very broad issue of, it's great to learn, but you have to learn at the right time with the right agreements in place.
I want to touch on something that Kevin brought up a second ago, thinking about how, AI might be used in sort of low complexity, like radiology, for example. Do you get concerned about that biasing radiologists in that case? Because now I'm only seeing a certain population of reports, right? So I'm only going to be ostensibly getting complex cases, so I'm going to be looking for things in that domain. Or I'm losing ability for some of those more simplified things I should be detecting. Right, how do you think about bias in that kind of concept based on what you're providing to a provider, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it will absolutely bias them. The question is, what's the downstream effect of it, right? And when it comes to the particular use cases, this is one of those hard areas that, is bias a bad thing? Not always, particularly if they're looking for more complex or subtle diagnoses. However, bias in the tool itself, starting to develop either racial, ethnic bias, or body habitus bias. There's a whole host of things where you can create in these reinforcement learning scenarios something that propagates and will get to the point of degrading the model and increasing error. So I think we always worry about that, and I don't have a great solution for what ongoing quality control looks like with these post-implementation.
This is something I really feel like the FDA should weigh in more on. Like, the FDA should have minimum fairness requirements, like minimum tests that are done on external and real-world validation, and then minimum performance metrics that need to be hit before approving these devices. I've been amazed at some of the minimal amount of validation that's been done to get devices approved.
Yeah, it's certainly, that's where the med device space is way different than pharma space as far as the amount of evidence required. You can, especially if you're a 510K device, you can really find a way in. If you can argue that even though you have an AI and you're using a product code that, maybe your predicates weren't AI, and you can find a way to be substantially equivalent, you can imagine the testing you have is still very limited and very similar to what was done before, and a lot of those issues can pop up.
Yeah, I mean, with a drug, you need a randomized controlled trial to see benefit. There's a JAMA Open article a couple of years ago showing, at that point, I think it was 45 randomized controlled trials of AI devices have ever been done. It's probably more now, probably closer to 100, but there's over 1,000 FDA-approved AI solutions. So,
well, and I think we're still waiting to see a prospective benefit on any of those randomized trials.
I think there was a question. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you think about patient populations changing over time? I imagine if you get some AI device approved by the FDA, then it's locked into stone. But then if over the course of, say, 10 years, the patient populations change, that might bias the model. Maybe you want to go in and update that. How do you think about that problem?
One of my other hats is I'm the chair of the AI Oversight Committee at Fairview. So we have a standardized process that we actually have a dashboard that all AI models that we deploy, we track them. So you could kind of think about how it looks. You get to pick your different metrics: F1 score, accuracy, AU-ROC, AU-PRC, and you can see how that changes over time. You can look at the performance for all patients. You can look at it by race. You can look at it by age. You can look at it by site, because we have 11 different hospitals. And then we have predefined metrics for when a model needs to undergo a review. So if there's a 10% performance change, the model has to undergo a review. That's our internal requirements. I think it's important that Nate talks about what does the FDA require for a lot of these tools, because go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a post-market surveillance, right? So if you are having a failure, if you will, of your devices, and you get to a certain number, it's not a set number, but kind of a number that flags, then FDA might have a review and say, well, why is this happening? And so it's not that robust. I think FDA is trying to be more robust. They had guidance documents about better diversity in clinical trials to get to this. There's some kind of question on what's being enforced and what's not, but I think it's still, the principles still are at play of how can you prove that your device is going to be applicable in your broad population, wherever it is you are. EU does the same thing. That's why there's a lot of local regulations in the EU, because they'll say Finland's different than Spain, so you've got to prove it each spot. But, that's where, if FDA gets the right signal, then you might have to pull your device. But being proactive and understanding your own algorithm and making sure as a company you're up to date and you have a change control process and plan in place is important. But FDA doesn't have like a great document that says, hey, every 10 years or something, you need to make sure it's still working. You could have a PMA device from 40 years, and if you never change the device and you never had enough adverse events that trigger a certain thing, you might have the exact same device, right? And so, a lot of it is more reactive, certainly from the FDA.
So I think the holy grail for most AI stuff is like predictive personalized medicine, right? So trying to intercept things, months, years in advance. I guess, what is your perspective on like the sort of minimum accuracy for anything sort of like predictive or proxy in nature for you to move on to some next step, right? So if you look at, say, like a retina scan, like what is that number that you have to see before you say, yeah, actually that's concerning, I'm gonna do this other test? Or even how do you broach like moving on to other tests given some sort of like predictive clinical support?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think there's the consideration of what's the risk of the intervention. What is the risk of a delayed diagnosis? Not all of them carry the same poor outcome. And user behavior is a challenge. You can have a perfect model. Let's take, for example, sepsis. If you can accurately predict sepsis, that would be wonderful. And some models are getting better by the day. But if you don't get the user to order antibiotics quickly, you will never show a clinical benefit. And so I think models are wonderful in the context of how they can aid the clinician to detect things that would surprise them or diagnostics that they're not immediately considering. The farther you move out from the intervention, so let's say it's predicting who'll be diabetic in the next year, that long duration makes it exceedingly difficult to have an effect on. So I see most models working toward things that have a short-term action that you want to help facilitate.
I'm actually going to reward Kevin in a way that it depends on your objective. Therefore, like if you're going for screening, then your sensitivity is more important. If you're going for diagnosis, then your specificity is going to be important. That also depends on also like the severity of the question of the problem that you have. Then if you have a severe problem, your false negatives are going to be troublesome. So you have to actually know what is the problem and what would happen if you don't act like.
Yeah. No, and that's a great point, because you also have to have a solution.
Yes.
We don't have an intervention, unfortunately, for every diagnosis that's effective.
Maybe kind of a follow-up then is there like a rule of thumb of number needed to treat for, or number needed to predict for you to consider?
It depends on your outcome. You can't give one number for everything. It literally depends on how life-threatening is that outcome. So sometimes it's like even doing one mistake, it can kill the person. So yes, you should go for the highest sensitivity, for instance, or specificity. But sometimes it's like, no, you have a room for error. So you can go for like lower accuracy. It depends on the objective that you have and the life-threatening nature of the problem.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring Nate into this conversation because I've also seen some companies in that arena go for an indication that they could go to FDA with as an orphan or a small population as part of their regulatory strategy before moving to a larger group.
Yeah, so in the medical device space, they're called humanitarian device usage or humanitarian device exemptions. And they do give you a pathway to market. You can't actually really make money on the device. You only kind of recoup the costs of it, so that is a limitation of it. But it is a great way to get started and to get some data. The amount of data required is unknown necessarily because it's kind of you have to prove a probable benefit versus the risk, and what does that mean? It's not 100% clear, right? So if you can get some signals, you might be able to go through FDA. But it's certainly a way to treat underserved populations or rare diseases. It's just you don't get that confidence. So when you talk about, this is another thing so the conversation you had is not always how FDA does it. because they look at, whatever statutory rule they're under for how they want to get approval. And it may not have any utility in the end, but the FDA doesn't know that. It might be better, though, than what is current. So the kind of statement of you can't miss at all if it's life-threatening is true, but it's true if there's something better on the market, right? If there's nothing better, FDA might say, shoot, we don't have anything, we'll give you an orphan drug status or a HDE status, and at least we have something a little bit better. And, it builds on, and a lot of times when I see those devices, it takes a while to really build up evidence and kind of get the momentum going because, the claims you get to make and the evidence you have to promote it aren't that great because of the pathway you took. I don't know if that answers it, Kevin, but that's the HDE pathway in a nutshell.
Yeah, in our program, we don't have minimum requirements for the tool to go live, but broad requirements, we're usually looking for a real world validation of around an AUROC of 0.7, or if it's a rare disease, an AUPRC 3 times higher than prevalence. It's kind of the ballpark that we're looking in. And yes, it really matters. Is it a screening test or a diagnostic test as well? Then we will select our cut point to be either closer to sensitivity or not. But yeah. And this is all for physician in the loop solutions. Obviously, AUROC of 0.7 is not adequate for autonomous AI. But yeah. We have time for one more question. I think there's a question in the middle somewhere. Yes. Okay. I'll bring the mic over.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the great conversation. I'm a student from the U. I'm a computer science student with background like AI and ML and robotics. How do someone like me get involved in medtech or medical device research or actual product?
So at the U, I can talk. There's a bunch of professors in the U that are doing a lot of different work. So there's the Data Science Initiative. You could reach out to them to get involved. You could email myself. Ju Sun in computer science does a lot of work, more so in the computer vision space. Ray Zhang, he's not in computer science, he's actually in surgery, but he runs our biomedical NLP lab if you're interested in NLP versus vision. But you could even just start with an email to myself, and I could plug you in from there.
Thank you. I've actually worked with Ju Sun before.
Oh, perfect. That's great.
Yeah, also, you're in Minneapolis, which is a major med device hub. So there's a lot of companies, corporations, they have a lot of different programs for outreach, especially for students at the U of M. So, using some of those opportunities, the localities to get involved is where I see a lot of people get jobs in the space afterwards. So.
And if you're also interested in the sensor part, International Institute for Biosensing also has collaboration with different tech companies so that it can also provide some project, and they have also some calls.
Yeah. Can I email you or? Yes, thank you.
And you're a student. You have an ability to ask for things that the rest of us up here could dream of at this point. So learn how to ask really well, and then just go ahead and build something. They're local entrepreneurial service organizations, find meetups, coding challenges, something that gets you out and talking to people. And if you can learn how to build and learn how to sell, you'll be unstoppable.
There's a lot of med tech conferences locally too. There's mini data analytics. I think they might have changed their name, but that's coming up. It's at Best Buy headquarters in the next week or two. You'll see a lot of people from a lot of the health systems, academia, and industry there. Yeah. Amazing question. So thank you everyone for bringing your energy, sharp thinking. I think that we could probably go for 3 more hours, but unfortunately it's 5:30. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and thank you everyone here for pushing the future of healthcare innovation forward. We'll see you at the showcase and networking events tonight. Thank you.